Hey guys, tonight we drift into the slow, symmetrical heart of empire, not through conquest or gold, but something much sleepier, Mughal Courtyard gardens. You're not walking into a battlefield or a royal court tonight. Nope. You're barefoot, eyes half-lidded, in the drowsy hush of a centuries-old garden, where the most exciting event is probably a bird taking off too loudly. It's mid-morning in Lahore. Though honestly, you wouldn't know it. The sun is a soft smear behind some ancient humidity, and this courtyard you're standing in doesn't care what century it is. The sandstone under your feet radiates a tired warmth. Jasmine vines creep up the columns. Somewhere, a bee gives up halfway to a flower. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, drop your location and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge slowly into the courtyard, the dust catching just enough light to look intentional. The geometry of the place is unmistakable, perfectly rectangular. Everything echoes balance. It's not beautiful in a flashy way. It's beautiful in a "we used math to simulate heaven" kind of way. That should tell you something about Mughal priorities. The garden has 4 equal quadrants, once lush, now mostly filled with defiant grass and weeds pretending to be heritage. A dry, marble channel cuts across the center. You follow it, expecting a fountain or a statue, but get a sun-baked lotus basin instead. Not a ripple in sight. Welcome to the Chaharbagh. Literally, 4 gardens, but metaphorically, a map of paradise. Mughal emperors borrowed the concept from Persian garden design, which borrowed it from older Central Asian layouts, which probably borrowed it from someone planting 2 fig trees in a rectangle back in 600 BCE. The Mughals turned it into an art form when they weren't too busy with fratricide. This was their flex the garden as a symbol of control, of beauty tamed into order. Here, emperors didn't just lounge. They reminded everyone they were kind of like God. If God had access to skilled irrigation workers. You pause beside a pomegranate tree. It shouldn't still be alive, yet here it is, valiantly fruiting in a forgotten corner. The roots must go deep. There's something slightly tragic about the whole space. You get the sense that this garden wasn't just neglected. It was ghosted by history. You're standing in a monument to a lifestyle that revolved around seasonal breezes, literary recitals, and the exact placement of shade at noon. And now it's all just cracked stone and pigeons. You brush your hand along a lattice screen. The jolly carvings are still sharp in places. These weren't just decorative. They filtered sunlight, cooled the breeze, and let women see without being seen. Imagine trying to garden with passive, aggressive geometry like that. Historians still argue whether the original Mughals truly lived in these gardens or simply displayed them. The line between habitat and habitat adjacent stage set is thin. Some sources insist emperors spent evenings under the stars here. Others suggest it was more of a very luxurious walk in closet for showing off textiles and peacocks. Speaking of which, you spot one. A real peacock. It struts across a mossy ledge, fully unaware of how on theme it is. It looks slightly annoyed. Same buddy. In the middle of the garden lies a platform, marble, raised, with no clear purpose now. Originally, this was where the emperor might have sat cross-legged, sipped rose water, and pretended to listen to poetry while subtly checking if the gardener trimmed the cypress too short. It was all about balance. Floral, political, emotional, and it's shockingly quiet. No kids, no music, just the whisper of an old neem tree swaying like it remembers something. The air is still thick with scent, earth, faded perfume, and something that smells almost like sandalwood, but could just be damp plaster. A fringe fact floats up. Did you know some Mughal emperors wore garlands of fresh flowers around their necks while walking these gardens? Not as fashion, but as a form of seasonal therapy. That's right. Flower-based mood management. predates your lavender essential oil diffuser by about 400 years. Another layer unfolds as you meander toward the edge of the courtyard. The perimeter paths are slightly raised, probably for drainage, but also to create a subtle height for walking nobility. So even their strolls came with a hierarchy. A minor platform to your left has collapsed, revealing the brick guts beneath the marble. That's the thing about Mughal design. Even decay comes in layers. Beneath elegance, there's practical engineering. Beneath that often, a hurried fix. Then termites. You hear footsteps, but it's just your own echo. These walls were built for acoustics, softening sharp sound and emphasizing murmurs. An ASMR dream centuries ahead of its time. Somewhere nearby, an older man sweeps silently with a bundle of reeds. He's not part of the tour. There is no tour. He might just live here, keeping the past tidy so it doesn't fully disappear. And then you see it, a sunken square with broken tiles. Once a pond, maybe even a swimming pool for royalty. The water's long gone, but the idea remains. This was leisure disguised as landscape. Everything had to mean something, and mean it quietly. One last historical nugget, before you drift toward the next chapter. Emperor Babur, the Mughal dynasty's founder, was obsessed with gardens. His memoirs mention specific trees, their smell after rain, even how certain stones felt underfoot. And yet, he hated India's climate. Too hot, too humid, too many flies, classic expat energy. So he kept building gardens, over and over, as if trying to summon Central Asia through geometry and water channels. You take a deep breath. The scent of dust and wilting jasmine is oddly comforting now. You shift your weight onto the raised path and follow it like an obedient line in a maze, curving slowly toward the center. The garden reveals its pattern, not all at once, but in steady whispers. This isn't just a random patch of trees and weeds. It's a chahar baug, a sacred geometry that wants you to feel something, even if that feeling is primarily existential confusion softened by grass. The layout clicks into place. 4 square plots, each split by narrow water channels. In theory, they'd all be lush, mini Edens brimming with life. In practice, one's got a stubborn bush, another's mostly dirt. The third is aggressively sprouting wild mint, and the fourth is hosting a catnap convention. But the blueprint, that still holds. This garden, like hundreds built during the height of Mughal rule, is modeled on descriptions of paradise from Islamic scripture. Specifically, the Quran mentions gardens beneath which rivers flow, lush, balanced, eternal. So naturally, the Mughals took that idea and did what any empire does when handed poetic imagery. They made it literal. And then hired 50 stonecutters. The result? The chahar bags, fourfold symmetry carved into the earth, with a central water source symbolizing divinity. It's paradise you can walk through, assuming you don't trip over a root. You pause on a small marble bridge that once spanned running water. The channel below it is bone, dry now. Just a bed of crumbling leaves and the occasional cigarette butt. Still, if you close your eyes, you can imagine the gurgle. Water once ran in all directions from this exact spot. North, south, east, west. An axis of spiritual serenity and irrigation logistics. Historians still argue whether the symbolic or the practical came first. Was it about evoking paradise, or just keeping things cool in Delhi's miserable summers? Probably both. The Mughals were deeply religious, but also very sweaty. You step carefully around a cracked tile. The entire garden's shape pulls outward from the center, almost like a flower blooming, not metaphorically, but mathematically. Every corner is equidistant from a fountain that no longer works, and every path radiates with a kind of worn-out intention. It's surprisingly calming, like walking through a piece of calligraphy where someone forgot to finish the strokes. A quirky detail, some gardens had underground water tunnels called qanats, imported from Persian engineering traditions. These hidden streams fed surface fountains silently. So, if you heard a trickle in the distance, it might not be surface water. It might be your garden whispering from below. You wander toward a tree, lined edge, where the planning seems suspiciously deliberate. On closer inspection, the tree species aren't just random ornamentals. Mango, pomegranate, cypress, neem, all chosen not just for aesthetics but meaning. The cypress, symbol of eternity. The mango, fertility. The pomegranate, unity. The neem, well, mostly mosquito control, but that counts too. And yes, those trees repeat. In perfectly mirrored positions, this was more than landscaping, it was devotional math. Every hedge, shrub, and petal was a tiny variable in a divine equation. You sit briefly on a dusty bench that might once have held royalty. Back then, someone in a ridiculous robe could have been sipping sherbet and discussing poetry that only made sense to people fluent in 7 languages. Today, you're just trying not to sneeze from the pollen. Above, a few birds circle lazily. Probably minus. One lands on the central platform and regards you like a bored docent. You stare back. There's something distinctly dreamlike about the layout. The balance, the repetition. It pulls you inward. Modern parks are sprawling and chaotic by comparison, full of winding paths and rogue squirrels. But a chaharbag, it doesn't meander. It invites you to stand still, reflect, or just nap upright like a noble in repose. Mughal emperors often wrote poetry while lounging in gardens like this. In fact, Babur once noted that a particular apricot tree in one of his gardens made him weep for Samarkand. That's the kind of vibe we're working with. Emotional weather tied to horticulture. And yet, this heavenly blueprint had its quirks. Some gardens stretched the 4 square rule. They'd add a 5th plot, just because, or distort the shape to fit a weird riverbank. Historians still debate whether these were architectural mistakes or deliberate metaphor breaks, like jazz, but for landscaping, you lean down and brush away some debris from a stone tile. Underneath is a carved rosette, barely visible. These small details once made the garden shimmer. Etched patterns that caught water droplets, turned puddles into starlight. Now they're mostly just dirt magnets, and the smell, it's changing as you move. Dry stone gives way to damp leaves. The garden's microclimates still function in a low, key way. Each quadrant catches sun differently. Some corners are cooler, even a little damp. It's like walking through seasonal moods. Sunny optimism here. Melancholy shade over there. One moody patch where nothing grows but moss and regret. Oh, and speaking of moods, a fringe theory suggests the layout wasn't just visual or religious, but emotional. The quadrants might have aligned with phases of life: childhood, youth, maturity, death. So yes, you might be standing in the existential crisis zone right now. The final stretch of the path leads you back to the center, completing the loop. A small platform once held a pavilion. Just a few pillars now, open to the air, where a prince might have leaned back and pretended to listen to court musicians while thinking about lunch. You imagine him, draped in silk, absent-mindedly twirling a flower, half asleep from the scent of jasmine and the slow rhythm of water. That's the real magic of the Chahar bag. It didn't just showcase beauty. It made beauty feel inevitable. Your feet crunch softly on gravel as you move back toward the center of the courtyard. The sun has shifted, dragging long shadows across the quadrants. Everything looks just slightly off kilter now. Not broken, just tired. Like the gardens had a long day that started in 1623 and hasn't let up since. You're standing at the heart of the Chahar Bai again, but this time you notice something else. The channels carved into the ground aren't just decoration. They're an entire hydrological system. Or they were, now they're just ornate gutters. Once this network of water channels threaded through the garden like veins. At the center, a raised pool or platform that held the main fountain. From there, gravity did the work. Gently sloping paths guided water outward into each quadrant. It was precise, elegant, and quiet, the opposite of modern plumbing. But now, dry cracked. A lone candy wrapper flutters through one of the channels like it's auditioning for a metaphor. You crouch down beside one of the marble aqueducts. It's lined with scalloped edges, half decorative, half practical. These ridges helped slow the water, breaking it into delicate ripples that caught the light. Imagine sunlight fracturing into golden lace over rosewater. Very Instagrammable. If phones had existed in Akbar's time, historians still argue whether these channels were filled constantly or only during courtly events. Some say they ran year-round, fed by elaborate underground cisterns. Others claim they were more seasonal, activated during festivals or imperial visits. Either way, they weren't just irrigation. They were performance art with a splash radius. You trace the channel with your fingertip. The marble is worn smooth, especially near corners where the water once turned. That turn, by the way, was calibrated. Too sharp, and the flow would stagnate. Too soft, and it would rush, disturbing the gravel beds that lined the pathways. This garden didn't just look peaceful. It was engineered to flow like a lullaby. Then there's the fountainheads. Most are missing now. But you spot the base of one, a lotus-shaped stone with tiny holes. Water would have sprayed in graceful arcs from those holes, catching the breeze just enough to cool the air, but not soak your silk tunic. Precision over spectacle. Mughal water features didn't roar, they murmured. Fun fact, one surviving Mughal garden in Kashmir still has working channels from this era. When activated, the water still travels the old paths perfectly, as if time forgot to clog it up with sediment and despair. You stroll alongside one of the lateral channels now, following it to the edge of the garden. Occasionally, small spouts branched off, mini fountains designed to create ambient noise. Not white noise exactly, but something better, blue noise. Random, soft, and rich in mid-frequency sound, like a stream whispering sweet nothings to your subconscious. The psychological effect was intentional. Garden architects knew the sound of water had a calming effect. Combined with symmetry and shade, it made the garden feel like a dream you couldn't quite remember, but didn't want to leave. This wasn't landscaping. It was lullaby architecture. Then you notice something odd, a channel that leads nowhere. Just ends abruptly at a tree stump. A modern historian might call it a construction error, but Mughal symbolism ran deep. Maybe that unfinished path meant something. Maybe the water was supposed to stop there, pooling in silence. Or maybe, as one quirky theory goes, it led to a portable garden segment that was dismantled when the emperor changed his mind. Like a luxury pop, up tent, but with bougainvillea. You pause near a half-buried valve stone. These were the off switches of Mughal hydraulics, hidden levers used to control the water's flow. Open one, and a dry channel would come alive with shimmering streams in seconds. Close it, and silence returned. All without a motor, a pump, or an email to maintenance. Another tidbit: the water was usually scented. Rosewater, orange blossom, even saffron-infused streams. Not only did that smell divine, it also masked the, let's say, less pleasant urban aromas drifting in from outside the walls. Think of it as early air freshener, the kind that cost the equivalent of a horse. You find a shaded bench beneath a fraying jujube tree. Its roots have cracked the marble path, and honestly, that feels kind of triumphant. Nature, casually reclaiming the grid. Nearby, the ghost of a shallow pool reflects a distorted sky. The basin's edges are decorated with faded inlay, tiny shards of turquoise, coral, and mother of pearl. The pool was never deep, just enough to mirror the heavens. Imagine reclining beside it, sipping cooled melon juice, while clouds float both above you and beneath your gaze. You sigh deeply. This place is so calm it's practically horizontal, and yet under that calm is pure control. Every line, every water path, every visual axis was micromanaged. Even the breeze was curated. Taller trees planted upwind, so cooler air would be funneled through archways. These gardens weren't wild. They were spreadsheets disguised as Eden. You rise and stretch slightly. A breeze rustles the neem leaves above. It's warm, but not hot. Dry, but not dusty. Somewhere in the distance, you hear a pigeon make a sound that can only be described as deeply unromantic. The spell breaks just a little. Still, you get it now. The garden isn't just beautiful. It's deliberate. The water once stitched everything together. Space, sound, scent, emotion. Now those channels are dry, but the design remains, waiting, dreaming. A geography of stillness where the only current is your wandering thought. You step over one last channel. No water. But you swear just for a moment. You hear a ripple anyway. Your sandals crunch softly along the outer edge of the courtyard, brushing past tufts of grass that have no business thriving in this much sunlight. And yet, here they are, like accidental metaphors. But you're not here for grass. You're here for the trees. And not just any trees. Mughal trees. Royal trees. Trees that had entire poetic reputations to uphold. You squint at the first one, and it squints back. A mango tree, all gnarly limbs and thick leaves, planted too close to the central water channel. It's not a native of formal Persian gardens, but the Mughals didn't care. They loved mangoes. Ate them, gifted them, even argued about their superiority in court poetry. This tree isn't just fruit bearing, it's a legacy of delicious diplomatic sabotage. Further along, a tamarind leans like it's eavesdropping. Not symmetrical, not formal, and definitely not easy to prune, yet here it grows. In many gardens, tamarind was added for both shade and culinary access. Mughal kitchens and gardens had a tight relationship. What bloomed here might simmer in a copper pot an hour later. Then you spot the cypress. Always the cypress. Tall, straight, moody. The Mughal garden's version of eyeliner. This tree shows up in paintings, poems, and way too many architectural metaphors. It symbolizes eternity, mainly because it doesn't fruit or flower. It just stands there, silently judging your mortality. Historians still argue whether cypress trees were chosen purely for symbolism, or also because they were low maintenance. Some suggest their funereal air made them feel profound. Others point out that they're just really good at surviving heat, bad pruning, and poetry readings. You take a slow lap around one quadrant where someone clearly planted roses. They're gone now, but the soil still smells faintly sweet, like a memory you don't own. Roses were the rock stars of Mughal horticulture. Yellow, white, pink, each with a specific scent profile and life philosophy. Some emperors even had rose calendars, planting by bloom schedule so they could time their walks with peak fragrance. Forget your weather app. This was seasonal scheduling based on petal performance. A quirky side note, during Shah Jahan's reign, gardeners were known to distill rosewater right in the courtyards. You'd walk past jasmine vines and, bam, a copper still burping floral mist into the breeze. DIY perfumery with imperial flair. You reach a corner where the trees suddenly change. Palms. Skinny, imported looking, and a little out of place. These weren't standard fare for Cowharbag layouts, but the British, bless their hearts, introduced them during later restoration efforts. Palm trees meant tropical empire to them. Never mind that palms offered very little shade and looked hilariously off, kilter among symmetrical beds and canals. You can almost hear the Mughal ghosts rolling their eyes. The garden breathes differently here. Each tree species creates its own microclimate. Shade patterns, moisture levels, even acoustics. Beneath the neem, the air buzzes softly with insect life. Under the mango, the light turns syrupy. The cypress corner, dead silent, like it's seen things. You pause beside a tree stump. Judging by the shape, it might have been a banyan. Those were rare informal gardens. Too sprawling, too stubborn, but occasionally one got planted, and then refused to leave. A slow rebellion in root form. There's a theory that tree placement in Mughal gardens also reflected Sufi metaphors. Trees as stages of spiritual development. Mango for sweetness, cypress for surrender, neem for resilience. That idea might be overrating. But then again, this was an empire that could turn a tulip into a political symbol. A bird swoops down, lands on a half-dismantled trellis, and stares at you like it's checking your historical credentials. You nod respectfully. It flies off. You reach another quadrant, this one heavier with shade. It feels cooler, not just in temperature but in attitude. The trees here are older. Thorny citrus bushes, maybe. Once used in Mughal medicine and kitchen experiments, their fruits were rarely eaten raw, too bitter. But the peels were used in tonics and teas meant to calm nerves, treat fever, or allegedly cure heartbreak. Ah, the apothecary garden. The quietest wing of emotional trage. A breeze stirs the leaves above you, and for a second, you realize how deliberate this was. The trees weren't just decoration. They created stages of scent and light. Enter the garden, and you moved through an olfactory sequence. Citrus sharpness gave way to rose sweetness, which mellowed under jasmine, only to be sobered again by cypress. It was a mood board with branches. You circle back toward the center, noticing a gap in one quadrant. No trees at all, just a long rectangle of worn gravel. This was probably a seasonal bed. Not for trees, but for annual flowers. Marigolds, petunias, or nasturtiums, swapped out like stage props, depending on the season or the ruler's vibe. Fun fringe fact, some Mughal gardens had rotating planters. Yes, literal turntables of flowers. One side sunny, one side shady. Just spin it, and the blooms adjusted. Because nothing says imperial control like commanding your begonias to pivot on demand. You shake your head, smiling. These trees, some native, some foreign, some symbolic, some stubborn, tell a quieter story than any battlefield. Here, dynasties argued through foliage. Empires were remembered not just in marble domes, but in how an apricot tree was trimmed. And as you sit beneath one now, leaning back against a warm trunk, you realize this forgotten geometry, this curated forest, this symphony of stillness. It's not dead, just dormant, waiting for someone to notice the cypress again. You linger beneath the cypress a while longer, letting its long shadow paint stripes across your face. The air has shifted again, heavier now, more intimate. You start wandering back along the inner wall of the garden, and suddenly you notice something odd, Eve. The silence here is louder, denser, more purposeful. The walls around you aren't just barriers, they're participants. You press your palm to one, cool stone, under the heat, softened plaster. These garden walls are thick, sometimes over 1 meter wide, and not always solid. Many conceal narrow passages or hollows built for airflow and acoustics. Mughal architects didn't just build for beauty, they built for whispers. You try speaking a single word, hello. The sound pings back softly, almost curved. You try again, quieter. The echo returns, perfectly shaped. This isn't your average courtyard reverb. It's acoustical choreography. Historians still debate whether these sound effects were accidental or designed. Some say the domed niches and carved alcoves naturally created soft echoes. Others argue that the patterns in the wall, like wave-shaped cornices and carved recesses, were deliberate, designed to carry voices selectively. Private conversations could echo back to the speaker, but not carry outward. It's architecture, as a confidant. You imagine two courtiers leaning in by the northeast alcove, discussing royal business, or maybe just gossiping about who wore too much sandalwood oil at last night's poetry reading. Their voices would stay folded into the corner, bouncing softly back like secrets kept on purpose. Further along the wall, you pass a series of jarokas, projecting stone balconies screened with jolly lattices. Behind those screens, women of the court might have observed garden gatherings, unseen. It's like surveillance, but make it floral, and extremely dignified. Some of these wall sections contain hidden walkways, narrow corridors, where a servant or guard could move silently from one quadrant to another. You press your ear to a faint gap in the plaster. Nothing now, but centuries ago, this might have been the whisper channel for moving messages or snacks. Then there's the niches. Every few steps, the wall folds inward. Shallow alcoves just large enough for a lamp or a vase. During the Golden Era, these spaces held scented oil lamps or flower arrangements. At dusk, the whole courtyard would flicker with amber light and jasmine smoke. It was less a garden party and more a choreographed dreamscape. You pass one such niche and notice a remnant of blue tile. Faded, chipped, but still holding onto its color like a stubborn ghost. Tiles like these were imported, sometimes from Iran, sometimes from Gujarat, each carrying a bit of sky to be embedded in stone. They caught moonlight, reflected water, and added a quiet shimmer to the walls, especially at night. A fringe detail you wouldn't guess some garden walls had embedded vessels, clay pots sealed into the masonry. These weren't decorative. They acted as sound dampeners or acoustic enhancers, depending on their placement. You're standing in an ancient ASMR machine. Basically, the stone beneath your feet has changed. Here, it's more porous, probably for drainage. Rainwater had to vanish fast so as not to drown flower beds or trip emperors in embroidered slippers. Some of these walls even had internal drains built inside them. You wouldn't see them, but they were there, quietly escorting excess water away from the party. You pause near an archway. The gateway is wide, flanked by floral carvings, and capped with a half-dome that looks deceptively plain, until you speak again. Your voice echoes straight up, then rains gently down. The Mughal architects loved this. A single phrase could bloom outward, like a ripple, and return to you softened, like your own words had changed their mind midair. And these weren't just pretty tricks. Acoustics in a Mughal courtyard had practical uses. Imagine a poet performing under one of these arches. His voice lifted effortlessly, no yelling required, or a call to prayer at sunset, carried across the garden without bells, just stone and breath. You follow a thin path along the base of the wall. Here, you notice tiny slits, air vents, almost invisible unless you're close. These allowed airflow to travel from shaded wall interiors into the garden, cooling the air subtly. Mughal architecture didn't just react to the climate, it manipulated it. Another quirky note: some walls had perfume bricks. No, seriously. Bricks soaked in sandalwood or rose essence were sometimes built into the walls of elite gardens. When warmed by the sun, they released gentle fragrance into the air. Try finding that feature in your modern condo. You reach a semi-collapsed corner where vines spill over the top like a garden forgetting its manners. The wall here is broken, revealing layers. Stone, lime plaster, a mix of broken ceramics, even a few clay fragments from earlier structures. Every Mughal courtyard is a lasagna of dynasties, built, rebuilt, redecorated, and occasionally repurposed for less noble activities, like being a goat pen during the 19th century. And despite all this grandeur, you notice there's no pompous signage, no carved declarations of glory. Mughal garden walls didn't need to scream. They whispered. That was the point. To create a private world within the chaos of empire. You weren't just in a garden. You were inside a memory that liked its own company. You take one last lap along the wall, this time trailing your fingers across the texture. Smooth, then pitted, then cool again. Each patch feels like a different sentence in the same very quiet story. The garden may be dry, and the petals long gone, but the walls remember. They always do. You've been pacing this old paradise for a while now, lulled by symmetry, teased by the silence, romanced by water that no longer flows. But suddenly, it all feels emptier. Not just neglected, but stripped. The corners are harsher, the beds more barren. The ghost of life here is thinner. You've arrived at the point in the story when the garden stopped being a garden. It's the late 1600s. Aurangzeb is emperor now, and things have changed. Gone are the fountains that sprayed rosewater for dramatic effect. The hanging baskets of marigolds, the orchid beds arranged like poetry stanzas, vanished. What remains is the architectural skeleton of beauty without the budget for beauty itself. Aurangzeb wasn't interested in gardens, or at least, not the kind you're walking through. Preferred tents, portable spaces, less fragrant oasis, more mobile empire with swords, austerity replaced indulgence, faith over flowers. And in the process, the once blooming Mughal courtyard garden started to dry up. Historians still argue whether this decline was ideological or economical. Did Aurangzeb loathe ornamentation, or was the empire too broke to fund weekly jasmine rotations? Probably both. But the result was the same: fewer gardeners, fewer petals, more silence. You step over a section of broken tile, possibly once part of a floral inlay. Now it's just rubble with ambition. The entire garden feels like it's holding its breath. A lesser known fact during this era: many gardens were converted into military staging grounds. Tents were pitched right where pomegranate trees once ripened. Troops drilled over irrigation channels. The Chahar Bagh grid became a layout for supply chains. Geometry reused. You pause by a shadowed alcove. Once, this space might have held a perfumed fountain. Now, it shelters a pile of bricks, neatly stacked as if someone intends to rebuild, but doesn't. Even the plant life seems confused. Invasive shrubs push through cracks, unsure if they belong. A skinny acacia leans sideways, like it wandered in from another century. You sit on what might have been a throne base, though honestly, it's hard to tell anymore. During Aurangzeb's reign, many garden features were removed or repurposed. Marble pavilions were stripped of decorative inlays. In some places, ornate tiles were dug up and sold. The opulence didn't just fade, it was deconstructed. And it wasn't just neglect. Aurangzeb actively curtailed music, art, and the visual excesses of the court. Garden parties became rare, poetry recitals suspect, and flower festivals, well, they weren't outlawed, but they certainly weren't encouraged. If Babur used gardens to remember paradise, Aurangzeb used them to remember that life was temporary. A fringe tidbit. Some surviving records from this era mention gardens being patrolled. Not for protection, but for discipline. The spaces were watched, not wandered. Whispered gossip was replaced with shouted orders, and picnics. Don't even ask. You trace your foot along a once irrigated bed. Dry, packed, hard as tile. Once a flowered path, now a historical cul-de-sac. There's something almost poetic about the way luxury decays when it's not wanted. This garden, once a gallery of fragrant self-expression, turned into a bureaucratic afterthought. The infrastructure remained. Channels, pathways, even a few trees. But the spirit evaporated. You pass a cluster of bricks where a pavilion once stood. The dome is long gone, the pillars crumbled. But you can still see the base outline, a perfect square. 4 steps leading to nowhere. You wonder if anyone noticed when the garden stopped blooming. Or if it just quietly receded into the background, like wallpaper in a very grim tent. Some scholars suggest this period marked the beginning of the Mughal garden's spiritual death. Without care, without purpose, the geometry remained, but the magic fled. And yet, the garden wasn't destroyed. It was simply ignored. Like an heirloom nobody wants, but doesn't dare throw away, you reach a section where the outer wall has been patched in crude stone. Likely post, Aurangzeb repairs. The craftsmanship is jarring. No carvings, no niches, just blank function. The shift in aesthetic is as loud as a trumpet blast. And yet, amid all this, a vine still clings to the wall. Pale green leaves, tiny flowers. It doesn't know it's growing in a dead garden. You smile. Not everything got the memo. The legacy of Aurangzeb's rule is complicated. Some hail him as devout and disciplined, others as joyless and rigid. His impact on gardens is rarely headline material, but here in the stillness, you feel it deeply. The Mughal courtyard lost its heart under his reign, not with fire or war, but with indifference. A final detail for the dreamers. Despite the decay, records show that even during Aurangzeb's time, some private courtyards survived. Hidden gardens, maintained by devoted caretakers or stubborn matriarchs who refused to let their flowers die. Not for show, not for politics, just for the scent of lilies on a summer evening. Glance up. A lone bee zigzags past you, disoriented, searching for nectar that isn't there. The garden quiet deepens as you pass through a narrow archway, so narrow, in fact, you have to twist slightly to slide through. The light changes. You've entered another courtyard, smaller, more secluded. The air smells faintly of rosewater, and something like sandalwood that's been diluted by centuries. This is the Zenana garden, the women's quarter. The walls here rise higher than in the main garden, and the space feels more like a whisper than a room. The chaharbag geometry persists, but it's softer somehow, less ceremonial, more private. If the main courtyard was a public performance, this space is the green room behind the curtain. You're not supposed to be here, technically. Mughal women lived behind screens, literal and social ones, and their gardens were rarely mentioned in public chronicles. But that's where things get interesting. Because despite the silence in the record books, these courtyards were anything but boring. You walk past a shaded path where the walls are carved with delicate jali screens. Those stone lattice windows that let in light and air, but kept the viewer hidden. From here, women could observe the sky, the trees, and each other without ever being seen. These screens weren't just architectural. They were symbolic. Freedom wrapped in restriction. Historians still argue whether Mughal royal women lived confined lives or wielded quiet power from behind the lattice. Some portray them as secluded figures. Others point to their letters, commissions, and the gardens they personally designed. Either way, this space was theirs. A fringe fact for you, some zenana gardens were scent-coded. Yes, scent. Rose for serenity. Jasmine for sociability. Marigold to keep insects and possibly bad vibes at bay. The planting here wasn't just pretty. It was a mood board with soil. You stroll along one of the quadrants and notice it's edged not with tall trees, but flowering shrubs. Harsingar, champa. Their blooms are small but fragrant. In these spaces, scale was different. The gardens didn't need to impress diplomats. They needed to soften the day, cool the body, and hold secrets gently. A vine wraps around a low trellis, possibly Madhumalti, the Indian honeysuckle. Mughal women were known to braid these flowers into their hair or steep them into oils. Every plant here served double duty decor and daily life. And the pavilions? Oh, the pavilions. Tiny, intimate, open on 3 sides, but enclosed just enough to sit shaded with your companions. You see one now. The stone still faintly polished where countless silks once swept across it. This is where the women gathered. To read, embroider, scheme, grieve, or just complain about whoever burned the milk again. You imagine it cushions spread on rugs, silver hookahs hissing softly, someone telling a story too scandalous to be written down. There was laughter here, maybe tears too, but definitely stories. These spaces were not idle. Royal women sometimes conducted political conversations here. A well-placed garden path became a power corridor. A conversation under a neem tree might lead to a letter sent across the empire. And when the emperors fell ill or went to war, the women waited here, watching the trees for signs or listening for footsteps bearing news. You pass a shallow basin that once held floating petals. Now, it's just a dry bowl with cracks that look like old maps. In its day, this basin was filled daily with water, flowers, sometimes even citrus slices. Mughal princesses walked past these bowls like modern-day influencers passing floral flat lays. Except the perfume was real and the setting less curated, more inherited. You sit beside a low marble platform that likely hosted evening poetry readings. Yes, even in the zenana. Women composed ghazals, debated verses, and sometimes patronized poets. Their garden was a page, their lives the ink. And there's a sound here, not noise. More like an echo of silence that's been lived in. The way a room sounds different after someone laughs in it. You hear a dove in the distance. Or maybe a pigeon doing its best impression of a dove. Either way, it fits. Another tiny detail, the zenana gardens often had different paths for different users. Narrower walkways for servants, broader ones for the residents. Privacy was layered like an onion, each petal revealing another level of quiet autonomy. You notice a tiny alcove in the wall, just large enough for a small oil lamp, probably used during twilight rituals. Evening was the magic hour here. The air cooler, the flowers open, everything designed for scent, softness, and slow revelation. And even though this garden is mostly stone and memory now, you can still feel it, the calm urgency of people whose world was both limited and luxurious. A kind of freedom framed by archways and floral scent. There's a breeze now, and the scent of some ghostly rose brushes past your cheek. It's not strong, but it's enough. You stand again, brushing dust from your palms, and glance back at the space. The geometry still holds. The secret still rests softly beneath the soil. This may have been a quiet courtyard, but it was never empty. You step back through the low arch, back into brighter air, where the sun sharpens the geometry again. It's hotter now, midday perhaps, and the light makes everything hum with a dry kind of tension. The garden feels different here, like it's trying to stand up straighter, show off a little. You're nearing the imperial zone. The scent of age and heat is stronger. And then suddenly, there it is ahead of you, a larger, more formal courtyard. This one sprawls just outside the Red Fort in Delhi, the great sandstone edifice that once held the very seat of Mughal power. And this garden, it's the emperor's side yard. You walk into it, and immediately the space feels oversized, a bit too tidy. Gone are the private little pathways and vine-laced trellises. This is a place meant to be seen, not felt. Wide marble paths, massive water tanks, and a lot of nothing, honestly. Just open space that once mattered more because of who walked through it than what grew in it. This was the Hayat Bakhsh Bagh, the life-giving garden, a grand name for a very formal space. It sits inside the imperial palace complex, an official chahar bagh built in the 17th century under Shah Jahan, the same guy who gifted the world the Taj Mahal. And true to his brand, this garden is pure architectural theater. Straight lines, stark balance. Every leaf once trimmed to perfection, every flower bed shaped like a calligraphic stroke. But don't let the symmetry fool you. This place wasn't really about plants. It was about presence. You pause near the edge of a long channel, now dry, but wide enough to have once sparkled with water cascading over smooth black stone. This garden was an extension of the throne room. When the emperor stepped out here, the garden became part of the performance. Framed vistas, mirrored pools, and of course, those iconic white marble pavilions with their open air views and crisp shadows. Historians still argue whether emperors actually relaxed in these spaces or just used them for ceremonies. Some accounts describe morning walks among the roses. Others suggest the garden mostly hosted formal parades and boring diplomatic greetings. You picture Shah Jahan gliding across a marble pathway, robes trailing, surrounded by courtiers, all trying to look casual and spiritually enlightened while secretly worrying if the imperial peacocks were behaving themselves. It's all a bit stiff, a bit too curated. And that's the thing. These palace gardens weren't loved. Not in the way the smaller, private ones were. They were flaunted. They were imperial selfies. A quirky fact, one of the garden's water channels originally flowed through the emperor's sleeping quarters. Yes, through the room. A constant stream trickling by the bed, regulating temperature, scent, and vibes. Imagine that level of commitment to ambient sound. You step into one of the surviving pavilions. The interior is bare now, just columns and light. But the acoustics remain sharp. You whisper, and the sound bounces back like it's eager to serve. At its peak, this space held cushions, incense burners, musicians, and maybe a caged bird or two for ambience. Now it holds dust and the gentle ghosts of silk robes brushing by. Out in the garden again, you notice a strange gap in one quadrant. No trees, no shrubs, just open dirt. It's not erosion, it's design. Some sections were left bare on purpose to highlight the starkness of structure. The Mughal aesthetic didn't always mean lush. Sometimes it meant, let's turn absence into a political metaphor. And then there's the fountains. You find the remnants of one, octagonal, bordered by what looks like broken mirror tiles. When active, it would have launched thin arcs of water in symmetrical bursts, like a slow, motion firework made of perfume. The noise, the shimmer, the scent, it was designed to dazzle, briefly, then vanish. A botanical mic drop. Another fringe tidbit, this garden once had night illumination. using oil lamps hidden in recesses and floating on water. Evening strolls were choreographed under the moon, with reflected flame dancing alongside you. Imagine strolling through that at twilight, your robe catching a glint, and knowing a dozen people are watching you, casually, from behind carved screens. You cross toward the far end, where the garden abruptly ends at a high wall. That wall wasn't a mistake. It framed the view from the emperor's audience hall. The garden was meant to be admired as much from above as from within, like a painting that moves when you walk through it. And here's a quiet irony. Despite all its grandeur, this garden was frequently ignored by the emperors themselves. As Mughal power waned, court life shrank. These grand courtyards became too large, too empty. By the time the British rolled in, many parts were already wilting. The fountains dried. The symmetry cracked. You crouch near a cluster of stones that once formed a fountain lip. There's still a groove there, where water wore down the marble from centuries of use. Even when the empire was collapsing, the water flowed. That feels oddly comforting. And now, you're here, in a garden designed for rulers, populated only by birds and ghosts. The peacocks are long gone, the guests, dust. But the garden hasn't disappeared, not fully. It just waits, still dressed in marble, holding its breath for the next performance. You step carefully onto a path that feels different underfoot. Softer, almost damp. The stones are moss-streaked, and the edges blur into grass, as if the garden itself forgot where it ends. A breeze stirs your hair, and you suddenly smell water. Real water, not just a memory of it. Ahead, you glimpse something extraordinary, a lake, but not just any lake, a man-made reservoir stretching toward the misty green hills of Kashmir. Floating on its surface is a garden. Yes, on the lake. Welcome to the floating gardens of the Mughal elite. You step into a wooden shikara boat. Those long, low vessels with curved roofs that glide across water like poetry in motion. The boatman rows slowly, gently, barely disturbing the mirrored surface. You lean out over the edge, fingers skimming the water as the garden draws closer. This is one of the famed lake gardens of Kashmir, and you're gliding toward the most storied of them all, the Shalimar Bagh, built by Emperor Jahangir for his beloved queen, Nur Jahan. Think of it as a royal love letter made of lilies and stone. The boat docks alongside a marble landing, just low enough to step onto without getting your feet wet. As you rise, the entire garden unfolds like a trick of the eye. Layered terraces, running water, and floral beds so symmetrically planted. You wonder if anyone ever dared pick a petal out of place. Unlike the courtyard gardens you've seen so far, this one rises in levels. It's built into the hillside, with cascading terraces, each one representing a mood, a season, or a philosophical concept. You step onto the first terrace, where rows of poplar trees frame a broad channel. The water still flows here, fed by mountain springs. It rushes fast and cold, cutting across the garden like a thread of silver. This was the emperor's public level, where guests arrived, received flower garlands, and probably were handed suspiciously heavy sherbet drinks. It's beautiful but formal, designed to impress, not to soothe. You climb to the second terrace. Fewer flowers here, more shade. The sound of water intensifies as fountains leap from stone lotus heads, forming graceful arcs that catch the sun like liquid glass. These fountains still work, by the way, over 400 years later. No electricity, just gravity, slope, and Mughal determination. Historians still argue whether these fountains were a marvel of mathematics or just really lucky plumbing. Some say each nozzle was calibrated to the precise width and pressure for the water to leap at a perfect angle. Others think it was trial and error, with a lot of yelling at the gardeners. You reach the third terrace, the private level. This was where Nur Jahan strolled with her retinue, possibly wearing floral slippers and carrying a falcon just for drama. The trees are taller here. Chinars, mostly. Their giant leaves cast dappled shade, and the soundscape shifts from rushing water to gentle trickle. You sit on a stone bench beside a pool. The water here is shallower, designed for reflection, both literal and metaphorical. Imagine an emperor peering into it, seeing stars at night, or maybe just watching his own mustache ripple. A quirky detail, these lake gardens were sometimes built on floating platforms made of interwoven logs and packed soil. That's right. Some of the blooms you see were growing on engineered rafts. If that doesn't impress you, try building a floating rose garden with no nails and 16th century tools. Beyond the pool, you notice small pavilions set into the hillside, each one aligned with the axis of the water channels. This wasn't random. Every window framed a view. Every bench caught the breeze just so. This garden didn't just exist. It choreographed your experience. And there's something different in the air here. Softer, cooler. You're higher in elevation, yes, but also surrounded by snow, fed lakes, and shaded by ancient trees. Kashmir was the Mughal summer getaway. When Delhi boiled, they packed up their court, climbed the passes, and reigned from a paradise that made their poets weep from sheer green overload. You stand again, crossing a narrow bridge that links two platforms over a side stream. The sound beneath your feet is rushing, constant. There's a stone lion's head spouting water, a standard Mughal feature. You wonder who carved it, how long it's been gurgling out this cold clarity. A final touch, the garden paths here aligned with scent traps. Yes, actual aromatic strategies. Certain flowers were planted so that, as you walked, the breeze would push their fragrance toward you. Lavender in the morning, saffron in the afternoon, and jasmine by twilight. The garden knew what time it was by smell. A fringe note, Jahangir supposedly had boat processions that included floating beds of marigolds, drifting musicians, and courtiers drifting half asleep under awnings of silk. Imagine an aquatic version of Coachella, but quieter and with better footwear. You sit again beside a lotus-filled pool. A dragonfly flits past. The water shimmers with tiny fish, utterly undisturbed by your presence. And for a brief moment, the garden feels alive, not preserved or reconstructed, but breathing. Moving. Dreaming. This is not a courtyard hemmed by walls. It's a floating geography, anchored only by love and gravity. And yet, somehow, it feels even more private than the imperial gardens you've already seen. You lean back, eyes half closed, and let the sun filter through the chinar leaves. The water murmurs, the mountains whisper, and the garden drifts gently on. The breeze shifts again, this time with the faintest trace of spice. You stir from your chinar, shaded seat, and begin to wander down a garden path worn thin by centuries of slippered footsteps. The Kashmir sun still glows gently, but now there's a whisper of melancholy in the air. The floral notes are fading. Something is changing in the rhythm. You're entering the emotional core of the Mughal garden, the place where scent and season weren't just aesthetic, but medicinal. These weren't just gardens of geometry. They were calendars of feeling. You pass through an arbor of saffron crocuses, tiny purple blossoms with golden centers. Once so prized they warranted guards and harvest ceremonies. The Mughals believed in seasonal harmony. You ate, wore, and smelled different things depending on the time of year. And their gardens, they obeyed the same logic. Spring was for sweetness. Summer, for cooling mints and vetiver. Autumn brought the melancholy spices saffron, myrrh, and the slow, burning scent of drying rose petals. Historians still argue whether these bloom schedules were just horticultural happenstance or deliberate emotional design, but the patterns are too precise to be coincidental. In spring, pavilions filled with narcissus. In monsoon season, the jasmine ruled. In winter, citrus and marigold to warm the soul. That's not landscaping. It's therapy with mulch. You pause at a low stone shelf where small jars once rested, herbal infusions made directly from the garden. The royal hakims, or physicians, would collect petals, roots, and bark from these very beds to create mood regulators. Rose for the anxious heart, basil for fatigue. Even opium poppies grew discreetly along shaded walls, not for parties, but for potent calm. You kneel beside one forgotten corner, where nothing seems to grow. And then, as your eyes adjust, you spotted a tiny bloom of chamomile, its white petals folded like a whispered secret. This little shrub was a nighttime favorite, its scent intensifying after dusk, lulling the sleepless into dreams. Not all medicines are bitter. You move along the pathway and reach an area that feels reflective. Not spiritually, but literally. Shallow pools once mirrored the sky here. They were arranged in curved formations, shaped like the crescent moon or teardrops. The symbolism wasn't subtle. This was the garden of grief. After all, not all walks were happy ones. Some Mughals mourned their lost beloveds here. Others contemplated exile, rebellion, or a particularly disappointing mango shipment. This garden made room for those moods too. The petals didn't always dance. Sometimes they drooped. And it wasn't just sadness. This section of the garden also held rituals. You see the low platform where an emperor once watched the first saffron flower of the season bloom. An act treated with reverence, almost ceremony. He didn't pick it, he just watched. Like witnessing a calendar turn itself. A fringe detail the Mughal court had designated garden watchers whose sole job was to track blooming patterns and emotional weather. One diary even records a courtier logging his mood against which flowers were open. Felt better today. Jasmine at peak. You walk past a cluster of dried twigs where tulsi once grew. Holy basil, sacred in many Indian traditions. It wasn't just revered for spiritual reasons. In these gardens, tulsi played a real role. It repelled pests, flavored water, and its scent allegedly cleared the mind. Plus, the emperors liked the look of it at sunset, shadowed, yet glowing. There's another aroma here now. Faint but unmistakable. It's the smell of wet earth, petrichor. And with it, the monsoon season arrives in your imagination. During the rains, the Mughal gardens transformed. Everything softened. Stone became slick. Paths were lined with clove and cardamom to warm the air. Lanterns floated in pools, flickering like grounded stars. The mood shifted from floral to foggy. You glance up. Even the trees respond to the season. The neem sheds less, the tamarind sweetens, and the air seems to sit lower. Gardens weren't fixed. They lived and breathed with the calendar. You stop at a basin filled with dried leaves. Perhaps once a bed for lotus flowers. Lotuses had deep symbolism. Blooming from muck, they represented renewal, spiritual purity. But they also just looked good at dusk, their petals curling like resting wings. You picture it a quiet evening, the emperor alone, watching the petals fold inward while the garden cooled. No courtiers, no music, just the rustle of vines and the silent hum of memory. And not every emotion had a flower. Some had sounds. Crickets were encouraged. Frogs tolerated. Even the breeze, filtered through tall reeds, produced a tone that some claimed eased heartache. Not cured, just softened. This was a garden of accommodations. Another quirky addition. The use of colored sand. In certain seasons, paths were sprinkled with dyed powders. Pale yellow in spring, deep maroon in autumn. Not because the grass needed it, but because the human heart sometimes craved visible change. You kneel beside one last path. It's empty now, just dust and a few ants, but once, it might have been a favorite route. A corridor of memory, shaped by scent and time. And that's the Mughal magic. The garden wasn't just a space. It was a mood board, a memory foam for the soul. You didn't just walk through it. You changed with it, slowly. Season by season, grief by grief, bloom by bloom. The scent of saffron and damp earth still lingers in your nose as you wander into a new corner of the garden. Quieter, somehow even more still than the rest. The wind seems to hold its breath here, and the trees sway in near perfect synchrony. You pause, your eyes tracing the lines of the path, and then it hits you. This part of the garden doesn't feel random. It feels aligned. Not just with itself, but with something much larger. This, you realize, is one of the Mughal gardens built in harmony with the stars. You look up. The sun is dipping slightly, casting longer shadows. But the garden structure doesn't just follow the light. It anticipates it. Every path, every channel, Every bloom bed is placed along a cosmic axis. Astronomy was not merely a science to the Mughals, it was philosophy, aesthetics, and a subtle flex all in one. This garden is a calendar, a map of the heavens, laid flat in petals and stone. You follow a path that runs perfectly east to west. No deviation, no curve. It ends at a fountain base, now dry, shaped like a starburst. Not decorative. Functional. At noon on the summer solstice, the sunlight would hit this exact spot, illuminating it in full, a sundial of stone and flower. Historians still argue whether the garden designs were built to reflect Islamic cosmology or more ancient astrological systems inherited from Persia and Central Asia. What's clear is that many of these gardens were more than botanical. They were tools of timekeeping. Sundials with roots. A fringe fact, some Mughal garden keepers would use shadow lengths from specific trees to tell time. The shadow of a neem tree in August. Mid-afternoon. The tilt of a poplar's shade in October. Late morning. Not perfectly precise, but enough to signal when the evening music should begin, or when the emperor's snack window opened. You pass through an arch aligned to the cardinal directions. Stand at its center, and the four garden quadrants radiate outward like the arms of a compass. Above you, a small vent in the dome filters a narrow beam of light downward, straight into the heart of the garden. And it wasn't just light. The Mughals cared deeply about moon phases too. Some garden parties were held only on full moon nights. Not just for ambience, but because certain plants, like moonflowers and night, blooming jasmine, opened only in moonlight. The garden literally came alive with silver petals. You lean against a wall carved with subtle patterns, repeating stars, crescents, and solar bursts. Some scholars think these weren't just artistic flourishes, they were cues, markers, astral breadcrumbs leading you to where you should stand to witness the equinox sunrise or the winter solstice shadow. Nearby, a dried-up square basin still holds its form. This wasn't just a pool, it was a mirror. A reflection of the sky, so that even while walking, you'd be walking through the stars. A playful detail, in some gardens, pebbles were arranged in swirling patterns that mimicked celestial spirals, like a galaxy underfoot. No one's sure if this was intentional or a bored gardener's flourish, but either way, it adds to the vibe. And those famous Mughal carpets, the ones laid out for royal gatherings in the garden, many were designed with constellations in mind. So, even when sitting on the ground, the emperor and his guests were resting on a woven sky. That's commitment to a theme. You round a corner and find a small platform raised slightly above the rest, possibly an observatory. Not for telescopes, but for stargazing and moon bathing. This was a ritual in itself. Sitting in the cool night air, absorbing the lunar nourishment, while the water channels glinted with reflected starlight. Think of it as the Mughal version of celestial mindfulness. You sit down where someone, 4 centuries ago, might have tracked Venus rising, or noted the precise tilt of a shadow across a lily bed. No Google Calendar, just petal, stone, and sky. And here's the twist, the garden wasn't just following the cosmos. It was trying to become it. The symmetry mirrored the divine order. The water channels flowed like celestial rivers, the square layout, a nod to the 4 cardinal points. The garden was a flattened model of paradise, shaped by astronomy. Another fringe theory, some believe certain tree placements were tied to zodiac signs. A tamarind here for Scorpio, a rose bush there for Libra. There's very little hard evidence, but the alignments are suspiciously poetic. You lie back on the stone now, letting your eyes trace the slow arc of the clouds. The garden doesn't need a telescope. It is a telescope, a slow, fragrant lens through which you feel not small, but precisely placed, and that was the goal. In a world of chaos, this was a space where everything had meaning, everything followed a rhythm, not of power, but of planets. The wind picks up again, a leaf drifts down, landing perfectly in the center of the path, balanced, aligned, and utterly content. You stretch your legs, stand slowly, and follow the winding path out of the starlit geometry and back toward the outer reaches of the garden. The stones grow newer, the lines a little sharper, the greenery less tangled. And then, unmistakably, the air changes, not in smell or sound, but in attitude. You've crossed into the British era. It's the mid-19th century now, and Mughal gardens have become awkward. The empire has faded. The British Raj is in full swing, and these courtyards, once layered with symbolism and seasonal emotion, are being tidied up, redesigned, improved. It's all happening with that very specific kind of imperial energy, meaning destruction disguised as landscaping. You walk along a perfectly mowed lawn that shouldn't be here. No Mughal garden ever featured grass this obsessively uniform. Yet there it is, imported from England, watered obsessively, trimmed with military precision. It's like someone dropped a cricket field into the middle of a centuries-old poem. The British didn't hate Mughal gardens, they just misunderstood them. To Victorian sensibilities, the geometry felt too rigid, the symbolism too foreign, and the purpose too fragrant. So they started redesigning the spaces to suit afternoon teas and colonial gatherings. Gone were the scented beds and cypress shadows. In came wide lawns, rose bushes arranged in circles, and benches that looked suspiciously like garden furniture catalog rejects. Historians still argue whether this redesign was strategic cultural erasure or just aesthetic tone deafness. Either way, the transformation was dramatic. The gardens didn't die. They were just rewritten in someone else's accent. You pass a section where the original Mughal water channels are still visible, but they've been paved over in sections to create tidy footpaths. Function lost. Flow forgotten. A quirky fact, in some cases, British officers mistook symbolic pavilions for storage sheds. Marble fountains became planter boxes, and jolly screens, removed or bricked up to prevent inappropriate breezes. Even ventilation wasn't safe from colonization. You reach a rotunda, an addition, clearly. It's circular, awkwardly centered in a square space. Probably added for symmetry's sake, which is hilarious considering it disrupts the actual symmetry that's been here for centuries. It feels like the garden is grimacing slightly. Oh, the labeling? Every surviving tree now has a plaque. Mango, Mangifera indica. Neem, Azadirachta indica. It's not wrong, but it's clinical. Like walking through a botanical museum where the passion's been drained and replaced with trivia. A nearby rose bush catches your eye. It's blooming in bright red, overly pruned, overly photogenic. Roses existed in the original Mughal gardens, of course, but not like this. Not this aggressively blooming, show pony version. These are display flowers. Pageant petals. You sit on a wrought iron bench installed sometime in the late 1800s. It squeaks under your weight. A peacock saunters by, looking somehow offended to be seen here. You both feel it. The vibe is off. And yet, it's not all lost. Some colonial officers, especially those stationed for long periods, fell in love with the old designs. They started to restore, replant, reimagine. Not always accurately, but sometimes with surprising tenderness. A few even wrote lengthy treatises on the importance of water channels, or translated Persian gardening manuals. A fringe tidbit, one British administrator in Lucknow kept a daily bloom journal modeled on Babur's own writings. He didn't get all the flower names right, but his efforts were earnest. His granddaughter later published the journal as a collection of Mughal meditations. It sold 8 copies. You walk further along and notice that some original elements have been preserved, perhaps by accident. A marble basin half, buried in lawn. A cypress tree leaning defiantly into the rose border. A jolly screen peeking through a plastered over wall like it's still eavesdropping on history. You touch the marble. It's warm, ancient, patient. And that's the strange truth about these gardens. They endure. Even when rebranded, clipped, and boxed into new empires, their essence hums beneath the redesigns. You can mow the grass, but you can't erase the axis. The geometry remains, like an old melody, just under a louder tune. A final thought: the British loved order. But they misunderstood Mughal order. Where the Mughals created balance to evoke the cosmos, the British chased uniformity to control space. Mughal gardens invited stillness. Colonial gardens enforced it. You rise again, walking past a hedge trimmed too perfectly toward a wall that's crumbling. Beyond it, a wild patch, untouched, possibly neglected, possibly free. You smile. Somewhere under those weeds, a water channel still waits. You squeeze past a collapsed gate, careful not to trip on the roots clawing through the foundation. On the other side, it's quieter still. The walls close in, the air goes heavier, and the path narrows into something more like a corridor than a garden walk. But the layout is still precise, unmistakably Mughal. And yet, something's different here. Something eerie. Because here, underfoot, beside the beds, and behind the hedges, are tombs. This part of the garden isn't just for leisure or luxury. It's a cemetery disguised as a paradise. Welcome to the most poetic real estate decision the Mughals ever made, placing graves in their gardens. You step around a low rectangular platform, worn smooth at the edges. No writing remains, but it's clearly a tomb, maybe of a courtier, or a favored poet, or a royal concubine no one wanted to bury too far from fragrance. You glance around and notice more. Some raised slightly, others sunken. Some surrounded by crumbling railings. Some pretending to be flower beds, with soft weeds growing from the cracks. It's strangely peaceful. Slightly spooky. Deeply beautiful. Historians still argue why the Mughals loved burying their dead in gardens. The popular answer is theological. The Quran describes paradise as a garden. So, naturally, you'd want your final resting place to be surrounded by flowing water, shade, and fruit trees. Eternal rest beneath a mango. But there's more to it. You crouch beside a particularly ornate tomb. It's sandstone etched with faint floral vines. It's not grand, not imperial, but someone clearly cared. Maybe it belonged to a child of the court, or a musician whose songs once floated through this very courtyard. A quirky detail: many Mughal tombs were deliberately placed at garden intersections. Not hidden away, but right where water channels crossed. That way, the grave was touched, symbolically, by the four rivers of paradise. Geography as afterlife planning. You pass another tomb, simpler this time. No dome, no inscription. Just a rectangle of marble sunk into the earth like a sleeping thought. The grass here is softer, slightly overgrown. You hesitate to step too close, out of instinct, or maybe respect. Even centuries later, it feels like someone's still listening. The most famous example, of course, is the Taj Mahal, a mausoleum inside a garden, or perhaps a garden containing a mausoleum. Shah Jahan built it not just for architectural wow factor, but as a literal representation of paradise for his beloved Mumtaz. Every flower bed was chosen to ease her spirit. Every shadow calculated to evoke peace. Even in grief, the Mughals remained landscape poets. You walk toward a dome structure at the end of a path. It's crumbling now, vines curling through cracks, but you can see what it once was: a charbagh tomb pavilion. The final garden within the garden. You step inside, and your voice echoes faintly. The dome is small, intimate. The tomb lies beneath it, encircled by fading tile and time. The chamber is cool, scented faintly of dust and dry rose petals. You imagine someone being led here once, veiled and silent, laying garlands and stepping back without a word. A fringe fact: some of these tomb gardens had underground chambers, not for secret burial, but for cooling. The dead were entombed beneath the main structure, and the air flowed gently down, keeping the interior chill even in scorching summers. Eternity, air-conditioned. You trace your fingers along the walls. Some tombs featured inscriptions not just of names, but poetry. Verses carved into the stone, lines about longing, the soul's journey, or metaphors about stars sinking behind mountains. You don't need to understand Persian to feel the ache. And here's the haunting part. Many of these tomb gardens were public. People came to picnic, to recite verses, even to nap, not in a creepy way, more like honoring the dead by continuing the living. To sit beside a tomb under a flowering gulmohar wasn't morbid. It was comforting. As if the barrier between worlds had softened under the scent of marigolds. You pass one last grave, small, almost hidden. A single stone with a faded rose carved into it. Perhaps a servant. Perhaps someone loved too quietly. Perhaps someone who just asked to be buried where the jasmine bloomed strongest. And you realize something. These Mughal courtyard gardens weren't divided between the living and the dead. They were designed to be shared. Life strolled beside memory. Flowers opened beside gravestones. Water trickled past both laughter and loss. You step back out into the main path, the sunlight a little more golden now, the air slightly cooler. The garden continues. So do you. You leave the tombs behind, though they seem to follow you in spirit. Every courtyard now feels a little heavier, like the past is peering out from behind every shadowed hedge. But as you move toward the edge of the old garden, something else creeps in. Not the weight of memory, but the sharp intrusion of absence. You stop. There's no path here. No flower beds, no stone channel, sun-baked ground. This is where a garden used to be. Not abandoned, not overgrown, just gone. You're standing on a space that once thrived with symmetry, scent, and water. But today, it's nothing more than a dusty void between a municipal road and a few apartment blocks. If you squint, you can almost see the ghost of a water channel, a faint dip in the ground. But maybe that's just wishful archaeology. This garden, like many others, was erased. Not by fire or flood, but by progress, urban expansion, civil engineering, or more accurately, the slow, indifferent sprawl of modern needs. Historians still argue how many Mughal gardens have been lost. Some say hundreds. Others suspect even more, unrecorded, unmarked, built over by highways or shopping complexes. The only evidence: bits of marble repurposed as staircases. A lone cypress tree growing beside a petrol pump. You wander along the edge, tracing what might have once been a wall. There's a pile of rubble nearby. Broken sandstone, shards of carved tile. Perhaps the remnants of a pavilion roof. Or maybe just the base of an old well. It's impossible to know now. No plaque, no preservation. Just wind and concrete. And yet, the air still remembers. You inhale. There's a faint, inexplicable coolness here. As if some part of the original design, a shadow path, a breeze corridor, still functions, even without the garden itself. You can almost hear the echo of footsteps over crushed rose petals. Almost. A quirky detail. During the 20th century, several Mughal gardens were casually bulldozed during road widening projects. One particularly tragic case involved leveling a 16th century garden to build a government car park. A single fountainhead was recovered and now sits on a shelf in a city museum. Unlabeled. You spot a tree in the distance. Out of place. Too symmetrical. You walk to it. Sure enough, it's a cypress. Alone, but clearly planted. It leans slightly east. That's your clue. It's standing where a Mughal axis once ran. The garden is gone, but the tree still follows the geometry. It's like a ghost seed. You keep moving, and the terrain shifts underfoot. Gravel gives way to asphalt. A sign says, Garden View Apartments, though there's no garden in sight. Somewhere beneath your feet, stones once aligned to cardinal directions. Water once flowed toward a central lotus basin. Now, water pools and potholes. The symmetry has drowned in bureaucracy. A fringe anecdote: in the 1970s, a developer in Delhi demolished a section of a surviving garden to build a cinema. During excavation, they unearthed a stone panel inscribed with a Persian verse. This is paradise for those who remember. The workers tossed it aside. The verse was never translated on site. You stop walking. There's nothing else here. Just smog, distant honking, and the faint outline of where something beautiful used to live. And here's the hardest part. No one knows the names of many of these gardens. They were unnamed, unofficial, or simply forgotten, passed down through oral tradition. The Rose Place, the quiet courtyard, where grandmother lit lamps on Thursdays, Now even those memories have dried up. You close your eyes and imagine it anyway. The quadrants, the fountains, the trees in perfect lines, children chasing shadows, women sitting in pavilions with silver hookahs and embroidered veils, men sipping rose sherbet and quoting Rumi, water glinting like silk ribbon under a full moon, and the air filled not with dust, but with lavender and birdsong. And now it's a bus stop. A final irony. Some of the original Mughal aqueducts still run under modern roads. Unused. Unacknowledged. Silent stone veins beneath layers of tar and traffic. The city rides above them without knowing. But the geometry never forgets. You step carefully back onto the pavement. One last glance over your shoulder. The garden is gone. But not quite. You cross back into the part of the city where history still lingers visibly, at least in patches. There are walls here with deliberate curves, steps that descend for no apparent reason, and rooftops that echo the domes of lost pavilions. You look up and spot something unusual: basil. On a roof. Not wild, not accidental, planted, tended. You smile. You climb a narrow staircase at the edge of a neighborhood, feet thudding against uneven stone. At the top, you find it, a terrace garden. Not grand, not symmetrical, but undeniably inspired by the old ones. This is where the Mughal garden lives now. Not in imperial courtyards, but in concrete tubs and mismatched clay pots, perched above a noisy city. A place of basil, mint, coriander, bougainvillea, and whatever else can be coaxed into bloom with compost and affection. You step onto the rooftop. The breeze is strong here, almost celebratory. It smells like earth, like effort. The pots are arranged in clusters, not quadrants. There's no central axis, but there is intention. Someone cared about how the shadows fall. A tiny water feature gurgles in the corner, more decorative than functional. But still, water moves. That counts for something. Historians don't argue much about rooftop gardens. They're too new, too modest, too rooted in the now. But if you look closely, you can see echoes. The basil is planted beside marigold. A shaded bench faces west for sunsets. A line of aloe vera follows a path of breeze. It's not the chahar-bai, but it remembers. A quirky detail: in some cities, terrace gardeners deliberately recreate Mughal planting lists from old court records. They can't afford the marble or water channels, but they can grow jasmine and mint in a paint bucket. It's paradise in a pickle tub. You sit on the ledge, legs dangling. Below, the city buzzes. But up here, it's calm. The breeze filters through neem leaves. A pigeon walks past like it owns the place. You notice someone's tied a string of seashells to a pole. They clatter softly like improvised wind chimes. It's not ceremonial. It's not royal. It's just peaceful. And that's the twist the emperors never saw coming. Their paradise layouts, once expressions of power and divine symmetry, have become deeply personal. Stripped of scale, perhaps, but not of soul. A terrace garden can't compete with 100 fountains. But it can give you a place to think, to smell basil after rain, to water something alive with your own hands. You close your eyes. The water murmurs. Somewhere, a rooftop hose squeaks to life. A crow caws. A flower pot overflows slightly. And still, you're in the garden. Not the one with jasmine terraces and sandalwood pathways, but the one you can touch, the one you can carry, the one that persists. You settle deeper into the rooftop, quiet, breath slowing, spine relaxing into the rhythm of dusk. The garden, whether floating on Kashmiri lakes or blooming quietly in a Delhi alley, has followed you across empires and endings. Each section, each petal, each slab of sandstone was a pause in history, a soft resistance to noise. Let it all dim now. The geometry fades first, squares, quadrants, channels, unfolding into softness. Then the walls, once heavy with whisper and heat, dissolve into breeze. Even the flowers recede, their scents trailing off like lullabies in reverse. What remains is motionless calm, the kind you don't notice until your thoughts slow to match it. You're not walking anymore. You're simply being. The last echo of water vanishes beneath your breath. The gravel, the peacocks, the ornate poetry of loss, They all blur into a hush. And now it's just stillness. Not empty. Just quiet enough to feel whole. Let your arms relax. Let your spine settle into its own axis. Let your memories of mango trees and moonlight dissolve like sugar in tea. The Mughals may have faded, their marble may have cracked, but their idea lingers, in scent, in shadow, in silence. You're part of it now. A petal, a path, a breath inside the garden.